The shadow I served in silence became the CEO who saved my life. Marissa J. Pig, the disinherited heiress of collapsed tech empire, is forced into a life of invisible servitude after witnessing her father's partner, Brian S. Ross, orchestrate a corporate execution that left her family in ruins. To escape Ross's lethal cleanup crew, Marissa assumes a vow of silence and reinvented herself as a nondescript, mute janitorial contractor. Her path leads her to the glass and steel fortress of Richard C. Bach, a ruthless, hyper-observant CEO known for his cold efficiency. For months, Marissa plays the role of a transparent, silent cleaner, but she is soon pulled into Bach's inner sanctum when he requires a personal assistant who cannot talk. Now, she is trapped in a 90th floor gilded cage where her silence is her only defense against the CEO, who is beginning to realize his miracle assistant is the very woman the world believes died in a tragic accident. Before we deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story. Because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it anything. Now, let's get into the story. The world believed that a woman's network was her greatest asset. For Marissa, it was a death warrant. It was a digital trail that had drawn the predators to her door. She sat on the edge of the cheap plastic chair in the employment agency. Her fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles were white. The room was fluorescent. The walls were beige. The very air in the Second Chances agency tasted of stale coffee and industrial bleach. She had not spoken a word in 3 months. And in those 3 months, for the first time in her life, she was safe. The silence was a shield, an armor she had forged in the fire of that last terrible night at the corporate gala just 1 year ago. She had been Marissa Pig, the brilliant miracle of Pig Industries, educated in data linguistics and global trade. She had lived in a glass penthouse, the jewel of her father's eye, but her father was dead. The offshore accounts that would have saved them were wiped clean, and the boardroom had been thrown open to the wolves. Brian S. Ross, the new CEO, had seized everything. He looked at Marissa as the last loose thread to be burned. The memory was a physical, choking thing. It came at night. The glass-walled office where Brian sat, his feet on her father's desk, drinking vintage scotch while his men erased the server logs. Brian's wife, a woman who had always envied Marissa's effortless grace, had stood by the window. "It's your voice," she had hissed. "So articulate. So superior. You talk as if this empire still belongs to you." That night in the office, Brian had smiled, the smile of a shark that had finally tasted blood. "My little genius," he'd slurred, walking toward her. "Living on my dividends. Such a smart, vocal bird. But you've stopped singing for me." She had backed away, her hand finding the cold edge of a glass trophy. "I'm calling the authorities, Brian." That was her mistake. Her voice, precise and authoritative. It lit fire of rage in Brian's eyes. He had grabbed her, his breath smelling of expensive cigars. "Your father is gone, Marissa. Your pretty degrees and your pretty words won't save you now. Only I can." She had done the only thing she could. She had screamed, not a cry for help, but a raw, animal sound of terror that brought the security guards running. But they were his guards. That was the moment the dream broke. She hadn't packed. She had run out the glass doors and into the pouring rain of a city. She had sold her mother's diamond watch for a bus ticket to a neighborhood where no one knew her name. The agency matron asked her name. "Marissa," she'd whispered. It was her last word. Since then, she was just a ghost in a gray uniform. Her silence made her invisible. No one looked at a girl with a mop. She was safe as long as she was silent. She would never speak again. The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos. A high-stakes masquerade where the clinking of crystal flutes sounded like the whetting of knives. Marissa stood at the center of the ballroom, the celebrated miracle of Pig Industries, her voice weaving through the crowd with the effortless precision of a symphony. She had spent the evening discussing data linguistics and market shifts, her father's proud hand resting on her shoulder. But as the clock struck midnight, the music didn't just stop, it curdled. The flashback hit her with the force of physical blow, the memory of the scent of expensive cigars, and the sudden, chilling absence of her father's shadow. Within an hour, The celebration had turned into a funeral. Her father had been found in his study. A tragedy. The police were already calling a suicide before the body was even cold. Marissa didn't cry. She didn't have time. She had been cornered in the glass-walled executive suite by Brian S. Ross, the man who had been her father's shadow for 20 years and was now wearing his title like a stolen coat. The office was a cage of moonlight and cold edges. Brian sat behind the mahogany desk, his boots marring the surface her father had polished with pride. He wasn't looking at the balance sheets. He was looking at her. His wife, Julia, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette sharp and brittle. "It's your voice, Marissa," Julia hissed, her reflection in the glass twisted by jealousy. That refined, Ivy League cadence. "You speak as if you're the one holding the gavel. You talk as if you're better than the rest of us." Brian leaned forward, the amber liquid in his glass catching the light like a predator's eye. "She's right, you know. It's that voice of yours. It's the only thing left of the pig legacy. It's the sound of a girl who thinks she can talk her way out of the grave." He rose, his movement slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them until Marissa could smell the vintage scotch on his breath. "Your father is gone. The server logs have been wiped. The miracle is over. You won't get away with this, Brian," Marissa had said, her voice steady, aristocratic, and lethal. "I know exactly which accounts you moved. I have the encryption keys. I will speak to the board, and I will destroy you." That was the moment she saw the shift. Her voice, her greatest instrument, had become her death warrant. The sound of her authority lit a bonfire of malice in Brian's eyes. He didn't want her money. He wanted her silence. He reached out, his hand clamping around her wrist with a bruising force that made her gasp. "That is exactly why you won't be speaking to anyone," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "Stop speaking. Every word you utter is a nail in your own coffin. You think you're a genius? You're a liability. You're a ghost who hasn't realized she's dead yet." He pulled her toward the balcony, the wind howling through the open door. In that moment, Marissa realized that the boardroom was no longer a place of business. It was a hunting ground. Her intelligence was a target, and her voice was a flare that gave away her position. To survive the monsters, she would have to become a shadow. She would have to kill the woman who knew how to speak, and become the girl who had nothing left to say. The cold rain of the city didn't wash away the past. It only made the grime of reality cling more fiercely to her skin. Marissa stood in the mouth of a damp alleyway, her lungs burning from a 3-mile sprint that had taken her far from the shimmering glass towers of the financial district. Behind her, the ghost of Marissa Pig lay dying in a puddle of muddy water. Before her lay the void. She reached into the collar of her soaked silk blouse and pulled out the only thing the wolves hadn't managed to strip from her, a delicate platinum locket encrusted with microscopic diamonds. It was her mother's last gift, a piece of a life that now felt like a fever dream. She stepped into a pawn shop that smelled of wet wool and copper. The man behind the plexiglass didn't look up, his eyes fixed on a flickering television screen. Without a word, Marissa placed a locket on the velvet tray. The man picked it up with a jeweler's loop, grunted, and slid a stack of greasy 20s across the counter, a fraction of it worth, but the price of a new life. As his fingers touched the metal, Marissa felt the final core of her identity snap. She didn't argue. She didn't negotiate. She simply took the cash and walked back out into the freezing deluge. The transformation began in a public restroom at the bus terminal. With a pair of rusted shears bought at a corner bodega, she hacked away the long, chestnut hair that had been her father's pride. The tresses fell into the stained sink like dead leaves. She scrubbed the expensive makeup from her face until her skin was raw and pale, revealing a girl who looked hollowed out, anonymous, and utterly breakable. She traded her designer coat for a shapeless, oversized hoodie found in a donation bin, pulling the hood low until her eyes were nothing but twin shadows. As she boarded a crosstown bus headed for the industrial docks, Marissa felt the weight of her silence settling into her marrow. She watched her reflection in the darkened window. A stranger stared back. No one on the bus looked at her. No one asked for her opinion. Without the expensive clothes and the confident posture, she had become a ghost in plain sight. She realized then that the world only truly hears those who demand to be heard. If she stopped demanding, She would cease to exist of men like Brian S. Ross. She found her destination in the sub-basement of a crumbling tenement building near the shipyards, a hotel for the nameless where rooms were rented by the week and questions were never asked. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and radiator steam. The manager, a man with skin like yellow parchment, pushed a ledger toward her. "Name," he wheezed. Marissa opened her mouth, but the sophisticated, melodic voice of the heiress was gone, trapped behind a wall of trauma and resolve. Her throat felt as though it had been fused shut with lead. She simply stared at him, her eyes wide and vacant. The man rolled his eyes, assuming she was just another broken soul spat out by the city's indifferent machinery. He scribbled them in the book and handed her a rusted key. She climbed down the concrete stairs of a room that was little more than a closet nestled against the building's thundering boiler. It was damp, dark, and smelled of lye, but it was a fortress. She sat on the thin mattress, her back against the vibrating pipes, and embraced the absolute stillness. Marissa Pig was dead. The shadow had been born. In the subterranean silence, she was finally invisible, and in that invisibility, she was finally free. The glass and steel monolith of Bach Industries pierced the clouds like a jagged obsidian needle, a monument to a power so absolute it didn't need to scream. Marissa stood at the service entrance, her frame swallowed by a shapeless navy blue jumpsuit that smelled of harsh citrus and industrial-grade detergent. In her hand, she gripped a heavy floor buffer, its weight a grounding anchor in a world that no longer recognized her. She had been assigned to the 90th floor, the executive level, the inner sanctum of Richard C. Bach. A year ago, she would have entered the front revolving doors as a peer, her heels clicking a rhythmic melody of authority against the marble. Today, she was just a ghost in the peripheral vision of the powerful. As she stepped into the private elevator, the ascent was so smooth it felt like a trick of the mind. When the door slid open, she was met with a silence far more expensive than the one she had cultivated in her sub-basement room. The executive floor was a landscape of brushed metal, shadow-gray carpets, and art that cost more than the tenement she now called home. She began to work, the low, mechanical hum of the buffer filling the corridor. She moved with practiced, rhythmic clumsiness, keeping her head ducked and her eyes fixed on the floor. It was here, amidst the scent of expensive cologne and high-end air filtration, that Marissa discovered the true power of her ruse. Without a title, she had lost her form. Without a voice, she had lost her humanity in the eyes of the elite. To the high-paid VPs rushing past with their encrypted tablets, she was a piece of the furniture, a moving extension of the cleaning equipment. They spoke freely as she polished the brass baseboards at their feet. They discussed hostile takeovers, leaked quarterly earnings, and the unfortunate disappearance of the pig heiress as if she were a deaf-mute statue. She watched the way their eyes skipped over her, never landing, never lingering. It was a profound, terrifying invisibility. She saw a senior executive leave his terminal unlocked to take a call. She saw the desperate, sweaty palms of a junior partner about to be fired. She knew their secrets before they even sat down for their meetings. She was a shadow in the corner, the one who saw the cracks in the glass before the building even shook. In the center of it all sat the office of Richard C. Bach. The door was a slab of reinforced smoked glass, etched with a minimalist logo. Through the transparency, she could see him, a man who seemed to be composed of nothing but sharp angles and cold intent. He was a predator who didn't hunt for sport, but for order. Marissa felt a shiver of recognition. He was the only one in the building who didn't seem to be performing. While others shouted into their phones to feel important, Bach sat in a pool of silence that rivaled her own. She realized then that her invisibility was her greatest weapon, but it was also a precipice. The more she learned, the more dangerous her silence became. She was no longer just a girl hiding from a monster. She was a witness in a house of glass, and the man in the corner office was the only one with the power to either shatter her shield or reinforce it. For now, she would keep her head down and her mop moving, a ghost haunting the hallways of an empire that had no idea its most dangerous secret was scrubbing its floors. The 90th floor was a theater of high-stakes deception, and Marissa had the best seat in the house. As the weeks bled into a blur of midnight shifts and the rhythmic spray of glass cleaner, she mastered the art of being a sentient shadow. She leaned into the role of the mute girl, allowing her gaze to go soft and vacant whenever a suit looked her way. It worked with frightening efficiency. Because they believed she lacked a voice, they assumed she lacked a mind. They spoke over her head about offshore diversions and backroom betrayals, treating her presence with the same disregard they gave the air conditioning vents. It was from this vantage point that she began to dismantle the myth of Richard C. Bach. To the world, he was a shadow king, an untouchable monolith of corporate power. But Marissa, kneeling to scrub the grout in his private washroom or polishing the mahogany shelves of his library, saw the fraying edges. She saw the way his jaw tightened when his chief financial officer, a man with a smile as oily as a spill, lingered too long after a briefing. She saw the subtle tremor in Richard's hand as he reviewed a series of internal memos that Marissa recognized instantly as a slow-acting poison. The same coordinated sabotage that had preceded her father's downfall. She watched him late into the night through the smoked glass of his inner office. He didn't know that the girl empty-handedly wiping the dust from his awards knew exactly what the red ink on his spreadsheets meant. He was being circled. His board of directors was a shark tank, and someone was feeding them blood from the inside. She saw Richard standing by the window, staring out at the city lights with a loneliness so acute it felt like a physical weight in the room. He was brilliant, yes, but he was isolated by his own perfection. He had built a fortress, but he had forgotten that the most dangerous enemies are the ones you invite in for coffee. One evening, while Marissa was replacing the liners in his wastebasket, Richard's head of security entered the room. The man didn't even glance at Marissa. He merely nodded toward her as if she were a piece of malfunctioning machinery. "The pig files are being moved tonight," the man whispered to Richard, unaware that the daughter of the man who owned those files was 3 feet away, smelling of citrus bleach. "Ross wants the final encryption keys. If we don't hand them over, he'll initiate the hostile takeover by Monday." Richard didn't respond immediately. He looked at the security chief, then his eyes drifted, almost accidentally, to Marissa. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. Marissa didn't flinch. She kept her expression simple, her eyes wide and uncomprehending, even as her mind roared with the realization that Brian S. Ross was reaching into this building, too. Richard's brow furrowed, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face, as if he sensed a pulse behind the mask. But then he looked away, dismissing the thought. Marissa left the office with a heavy heart and a mind like a tactical map. She saw the trap closing around him, the same one that had snapped shut on her father. Richard C. Bach was powerful, but he was blind to the invisible people who actually kept his world turning. He thought he was alone in his fight, but in the corner of his eye, a ghost was beginning to sharpen into a weapon. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 5, where Richard C. Bach officially seeks a personal assistant who cannot leak secrets? The Second Chances Agency was a place where human potential went to die, a liminal space between the forgotten and the used. The air was thick with the hum of a flickering fluorescent light, and the drone of a woman behind a desk who had long ago traded her empathy for a pension plan. Marissa sat in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, her hood pulled low. She was a ghost in a waiting room of shadows. Then the heavy glass door swung open, and the atmosphere in the room shifted, as if the oxygen had suddenly been sucked out by a vacuum. Richard C. Bach did not walk into a room. He claimed it. He stood in the center of the linoleum floor, his charcoal gray suit a stark, expensive contrast to the peeling wallpaper. He looked like a man who had walked out of a high-tech fortress and into a wasteland, his eyes scanning the candidates with a cold, clinical detachment. The agency manager, a woman named Mrs. Gable, practically tripped over her own feet to reach him, her face twisting into a sycophantic grin that Marissa had seen 1,000 times in her former life. "Mr. Bach, we didn't expect a personal visit," Mrs. Gable chirped, her voice grating against the stillness. "We have several top-tier candidates for the administrative role. Multilingual, certified, impeccable references." "I don't want a candidate," Richard interrupted, his voice a low, resonant blade. "I want a void." He didn't look at the resumes Mrs. Gable was frantically thrusting toward him. He paced the small room, his presence making the walls feel as though they were closing in. "My office is a sieve. Information is leaking like water through a cracked hull. I don't need a secretary with an MBA and a social media following. I need someone who does not exist to the outside world. I need an assistant who can handle the most sensitive data in the city and has no one to tell it to. He stopped, his back to Marissa, his hands clasped behind him. I need someone who cannot speak to the press, cannot speak to my board, and cannot speak to my enemies. A ghost who is paid to be a witness, not a participant. Mrs. Gable blinked, her smile faltering as she struggled to reconcile the request with her database of eager graduates. Well, sir, we have some very discreet individuals, but cannot is a strong word. Are you looking for a non-disclosure agreement? I am looking for a biological certainty, Richard said, turning slowly. His gaze swept over the row of desperate women, passing over the ones who sat up straighter, the ones who tried to catch his eye with a flirtatious spark or professional nod. I need absolute discretion. A vacuum, a silence that isn't a choice, but a state of being. Marissa felt a cold prickle of electricity run down her spine. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on her worn-out sneakers, but she could feel his attention moving like a spotlight. For months, she had been a shadow on his floor, a girl with a mop who heard the secrets he thought were buried. Now, he was here, looking for the very shield she had spent a year forging in the dark. He wasn't looking for an employee. He was looking for a miracle of silence. And Marissa, tucked into her oversized hoodie, realized that the cage was about to get much smaller and the stakes infinitely higher. The air in the cramped agency office grew thin, vibrating with the frantic energy of the other women. As Mrs. Gable signaled for them to stand, the line formed, a row of desperate hope and polished ambition. The candidates to Marissa's left and right shifted their weight, smoothing invisible wrinkles in their bargain bin blazers and practicing smiles that were meant to look capable but ended up looking terrified. They were eager to be seen, to be heard, to be rescued. They offered their Ivy League credentials and their can-do spirits like sacrifices to a God who had no interest in their prayers. Richard C. Bach moved down the line with the predatory grace of a man who had never been told no. He didn't look at their faces. He looked at their hands, their eyes, the way their breath hitched as he approached. He bypassed a Rhodes Scholar who was mid-sentence, her pitch for her organizational skills dying in her throat as he walked past her without a glance. He ignored the girl with a master's degree in cybersecurity, who tried to offer a firm, professional handshake. To Richard, they were just more noise, more voices that could be bought, coerced, or broken. Then, the world seemed to tilt and go silent as he reached the end of the row. Marissa did not stand up straighter. She did not fix her hair. She stood with her shoulders slumped in her oversized hoodie, her hands buried in her pockets, her gaze fixed on a jagged crack in floorboards. She felt the sudden, heavy heat of his presence, a magnetic force that demanded she look up, but she remained anchored in her void. She was a statue of gray wool and buried trauma. Richard stopped. He didn't move for a long, agonizing minute. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a sledgehammer against stone. Behind him, Mrs. Gable began to titter nervously. "Oh, not that one, Mr. Bach. That's just, well, she's a temporary placement from the maintenance pool. A traumatic background, we believe. She doesn't speak. Selectively mute, or perhaps something more profound. She's quite simple, really. Very good with a mop, but hardly executive material." Richard didn't hear her. He stepped into Marissa's personal space. So close she could smell the cold, sharp scent of cedar and expensive steel that clung to his coat. He leaned down, his eyes sharp as a high-frequency blade, searching for the bottom of her silence. He wasn't looking for a resume. He was looking for a reflection of the stillness he carried in his own soul. He saw the way she didn't flinch. He saw the way her eyes didn't dart in search of approval. In the depths of her gaze, beneath the carefully maintained mask of the simple girl, Richard saw something that made his own pulse quicken. He didn't see a simpleton. He saw a survivor. He saw a profound, shattered stillness that spoke of a high-velocity impact with the world, a woman who had been to the fire and come out as ash, yet remained standing. It was the look of a thoroughbred hidden in a stable of mules. Her, Richard said. The word wasn't question. It was a verdict. "But, sir, she's a janitor," Mrs. Gable stammered, her face turning a blotchy red. "She can't answer phones. She can't take dictation. She's practically a ghost." "Exactly." Richard replied, his voice a low, satisfied growl. He didn't take his eyes off Marissa. He reached out, his gloved finger tilting her chin up just enough to force her to meet his stare. She is exactly the kind of miracle I've been looking for. A ghost who knows how to listen. Mrs. Gable's office felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, the air thick with a scent of cheap perfume and the underlying tang of panic. She scrambled behind her desk, her hands fluttering over Marissa's thin file, as if she could somehow find a reason to talk the most powerful man in the city out of a disastrous mistake. She looked at Marissa, who stood by the door like a forgotten shadow, and then back to Richard C. Bach, who occupied the room's only guest chair with the lethal composure of a king on a temporary throne. "Mr. Bach, I really must insist on a formal evaluation," Mrs. Gable began, her voice reaching a shrill, desperate pitch. The girl, she isn't just quiet. She's damaged. Broken, really. We've had her in the maintenance pool because she can follow basic, repetitive instructions, but she lacks the cognitive agility for your world. She's a selective mute, possibly from a traumatic event, or perhaps she simply isn't all there. She won't understand the nuance of your business. She's a simple soul in a complex house. Marissa kept her gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in a sliver of sunlight, her expression a blank canvas. She felt the sting of the damaged label, a sharp contrast to the woman who had once navigated high-frequency trading algorithms and philanthropic gals with ease. But she leaned into the insult. If they thought she was simple, they wouldn't look for the genius. If they thought she was broken, they wouldn't expect her to fight back. Richard didn't look at the file. He didn't even look at Mrs. Gable. His eyes remained anchored on Marissa, watching the way she breathed, steady, shallow, and controlled. "You say she's damaged as if that were a liability," Richard said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "In my world, Gable, everyone is agile. Everyone is ambitious. They are so busy proving how much they know that they forget how to hear. They fill the silence with their own voices until they can't hear the knife being drawn behind them." He stood up, the movement fluid and intimidating. "I don't need agility. I need a constant. I don't need her to understand my nuance. I need her to ignore it. Her silence isn't a defect, Mrs. Gable. It's a filtration system. It's refreshing." He walked toward Marissa, stopping just inches away. The power radiating from him was a cold, magnetic force. A damaged tool can be sharpened. A loud one only ever grows duller. Mrs. Gable opened her mouth to argue, but the look in Richard's eyes silenced her more effectively than any non-disclosure agreement. She sighed, a defeated, weary sound, and stamped the transfer papers with a heavy thud. "Fine, she's yours. But don't say I didn't warn you when she fails to meet a single deadline. She's a ghost, Mr. Bach. You're hiring a ghost to run an empire. I'm not hiring her to run it," Richard replied, his hand moving to the small of Marissa's back, a gesture that was less an embrace and more acclaim. "I'm hiring her to haunt it." As they walked out of the agency and toward the idling black sedan, the city noise felt distant and muffled. Marissa felt the weight of the simple label falling away, replaced by something far more dangerous. The CEO's fascination. She was no longer a janitor, and she was no longer safe in the shadows of the sub-basement. She was being elevated to the heights of the 90th floor, not as a peer, but as a miracle of silence, a secret weapon Richard C. Bach didn't yet realize was fully loaded. The private elevator ascended in a vacuum of sound, the digital floor counter flickering upward with dizzying speed until it hit 90. When the door slid open, the air changed. It became crisp, oxygen-rich, and scented with a faint, expensive musk of aged cedar and ozone. Marissa stepped out onto the plush, slate-gray carpet, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was no longer in the maintenance tunnels. She was back in the clouds. Richard led her through a labyrinth of glass and polished steel, his stride confident and territorial. The suite was a masterpiece of minimalist brutality. Soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling, neon-veined city, and furniture that looked more like sculpture than something meant for human comfort. It was a palace built for a man who lived at the center of a storm. But to Marissa, every glint of reflected light felt like a needle. She had spent a year learning to live in the dark, and this sudden, panoramic exposure felt like being stripped naked. "This is your station," Richard said, gesturing toward a sleek, obsidian desk situated just outside his primary office. "You will be here when I arrive, and you will stay until I leave. You will handle the physical files, the hard copy encryptions, and the items too sensitive for the digital grid." Marissa stood by the desk, her hands folded into the sleeves of her hoodie, her eyes tracking the movement of the clouds outside the window. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had fled a gilded cage in a rainstorm only to be escorted into a more fortified one in a black sedan. The high-rise view was a haunting echo of her father's office. The same vertigo, the same sense of being disconnected from the real world below. She looked at the high-tech security pads and the biometric scanners on the doors. This wasn't an office. It was a fortress. And while the world saw a promotion, Marissa saw a trap. She was now a captive of the very thing she used to be. The luxury around her, the silent climate control, the designer lighting, the absolute privacy, was designed to keep the world out, but it also kept her in. She was a CEO's shadow, a simple miracle meant to sit in the stillness and absorb the secrets that drifted through the air like dust. Richard walked to the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, dark line against the sunset. He looked out at the empire he had built, unaware that the girl standing behind him was calculating the structural integrity of every glass wall in the room. "Most people find the height intimidating," Richard remarked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face for a crack in the mask. "But you look like you've been here before. You look like you're waiting for the floor to fall away." Marissa didn't move. She didn't let the flicker of recognition show. She kept her gaze vacant, her posture slumped, playing the role of the broken girl who didn't understand the view. She was a ghost haunting a boardroom, a witness in a luxury cage. She had lived this life once as a princess, and she knew exactly how the story ended, with fire and glass. As the night shadows began to stretch across the 90th floor, Marissa realized that her silence would have to be more than a shield now. It would have to be a weapon. The 90th floor settled into a heavy, expectant rhythm as Marissa took her place at the obsidian desk. She became the silent clockwork of Richard's inner sanctum, moving to the periphery of his life with the weightless precision of a haunting. To the world outside the glass doors, she was a nonentity, a simple mute who served coffee and shredded sensitive memos. But inside the quiet, she was a sentinel. She watched as Richard navigated the treacherous currents of his board meetings, his back perpetually to the wall, his eyes never truly resting. He was a man fighting a war in a suit of armor that was starting to show the same fractures she had seen in her father's final days. For weeks, Marissa maintained her vow, keeping her brilliance locked behind a blank stare and a slumped posture. She was a ghost in the boardroom, present for every whisper betrayal and every covert threat made by the men who sought to dismantle Richard's legacy. She saw the same wolves who had devoured the Pig Empire, Brian S., Ross's silent partners, circling Richard, waiting for a single moment of weakness. She felt the urge to scream a warning, to speak the names of the traitors, but the leaden weight of her trauma kept her throat fused shut. She had convinced herself that her silence was her only safety, that to speak was to die. But as the late-night shifts bled into early mornings, the dynamic began to shift. Richard didn't treat her like a servant. He treated her like a confessional. He would speak his strategies aloud, testing his logic against her silence, perhaps sensing that she was the only person in his life who wasn't trying to steal a piece of his soul. One midnight, as a storm rattled the reinforced glass, Richard dropped a decrypted file onto her desk. His face was gray with exhaustion, the mask of the Shadow King slipping to reveal a man who was drowning in a sea of sharks. "They think I don't see the trap," he whispered, more to himself than to her, his hand resting near hers on the cold stone. "They think because I am alone, I am blind. But the more they try to quiet me, the more I realize that the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs someone to carry out the fire." He looked at her then, not with the clinical interest of an employer, but with a profound, searing recognition. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a mirror. He had spent his life building a fortress of silence to protect his integrity, much like she had built her mute persona to protect her life. In that shared wordless moment, Marissa realized that Richard wasn't a monster she had to fear. He was the miracle she had been waiting for. He was the only man with enough power to house her truth and enough steel to defend it. The shadow she had served in silence was no longer a cage. He was a partner in the dark. As she reached out and pulled the encrypted file toward her, her fingers brushed his, a silent promise of a counterstrike. She wouldn't speak yet, not until the trap was set for the wolves. But as she watched him walk back into his office, Marissa felt the first cracks in her vow of iron. She was still a ghost, but for the first time in a year, she was a ghost with a purpose. The silence was no longer just a shield. It was a quiet before the storm that would reclaim everything she had lost. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is crazy and more intriguing as you can ever image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.